and because it's crucial now in this moment of uncertainty, of difficulties in the world, that we reach out. It's not enough to focus on the transatlantic relationship between the US and Europe. We need to include Latin America. It's crucial that we include Latin America in this discussion, and it's very important that today we're going to talk about Latin America, its challenges, and the present situation. So for us, Latin America, it's a crucial pillar of our foreign policy. We're going to start the presidency of the Council of the European Union in a few weeks, and we're going to start in July, early in July, with a summit, the EU-CELAC Summit. We will be organizing here in Washington different events because in this reinforced dialogue between the EU and the CELAC countries, we want to include also the United States of America. So I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting discussion today. Again, thank you very much, and I take the occasion for a short commercial. This is also a very important week here for us because we are organizing many events. We call them Spain in DC, theater, cinema, book presentation, exhibitions. This is an important week for us, and I would like to congratulate you, Miguel, and your wonderful team for doing this and including this very important discussion, the EFE Dialogues. Patricia, muchas gracias de nuevo, and welcome again. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Cabanas, for your kind words. Muchas gracias, Embajador. Welcome, everybody. Bienvenidos a todos. This panel is going to be in English, but maybe we're going to change if one of the panelists wants, or if one of the people from the audience wants to ask in Spanish. So thank you very much for being here. As Ambassador Cabanas says, for us it's very important to have these very important panelists in this discussion in our first EFE Dialogues. As you know, we are the first news wire in Spanish in the world and the fourth worldwide. And for us, Latin America is very important. It's our first market. And we decided that Latin America should be the topic, the main topic of our first dialogue here in Washington. Anyway, we hope this won't be the last, but the first of a broader discussions here in Washington. We want to be part of the debate in the capital of the United States. And so we're gonna begin. As you know, Latin America is, as the rest of the world, living moments of uncertainty, difficulties, economic and in a lot of political crisis too. And I would like both the three of you to give us our opinion, your opinion about a lot of issues. So I would like to begin with Ilan. Ilan Golfan, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce them. As you know, we have here with us Ilan Golfan. He's the president of the Inter-American Development Bank. We have with us too Juan Gonzalez. Juan Gonzalez is the special assistant to the president and National Security Council Senior Director of the Western Hemisphere. And Cynthia Arson. Cynthia is a distinguished fellow in the Wilson Center. She was the Latin American Director program. And as I said, we would like to begin with you, Ilan. As you know, the region is living difficult times, but has some resilience in these years. But I think it's still being affected by high inflation. And as you know, high inflation, we talked about this, means more poverty and more inequality. So what are the priorities of the IDB in this particular moment?
Thank you, Patricia. It's an honor to be here in this panel with Juan Gonzalez and Cynthia and being in this wonderful house that you know. And I'm looking forward for the Spain week. Just send me the agenda. I love that. So thank you for being here. Latin America, you're right. We have been in a period where more stress shocks come from the pandemic, from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, high inflation, food inflation, energy, transport costs going higher. That means that we gave up a few years of improving on poverty in just a couple of years. In addition, there is some concerns that the growth rate that we had last year of 3.9%, which was quite high, will decelerate this year, and our own projections, but also other institutions are forecasting lower growth. But I want to concentrate, when you ask me about the priorities, I want to concentrate on what I believe are more structural issues that we have to address. I mean, the IDB looks at medium-term and long-term too. Our loan portfolio has a longer duration. We look at how the countries will be doing over time. So the triple challenge we are seeing now is the fact that society is now seems to be more impatient with governments to deliver what they believe are important public goods, if you want, services, health, education. They are tired of the poverty. They had some improvement, they're coming back. They are not happy with the inequality that has been for years in Latin America. They are now looking at other type of inequality, diversity in general, gender, and others. They care about climate. So there is a very important demand for governments. And we can see them both in the normal electoral process with changing governments and promises, but we can see them also in the street, in protests, and things that we are seeing over. So there is a clear demand and time-sensitive demand for more government actions. But the governments do not have more resources. Actually, they may have even less resources because debts are higher, coming from the pandemic. To give you an example, average debt of Latin American Caribbean was 60%, it went to 70%. There was some consolidation, 65%, relatively high, which means that some are below, but some are higher than 65, and that means that resources are constrained. So the answer usually is, let's create the resources. But creation of resources means growth. And growth has been difficult to generate in Latin America and the Caribbean. Average growth rate has been 2% for decades. There were some decades that we said Latin America is in the lost decades, and the lost decades were growth related. So that's an issue so having said this challenge, what are the priorities? First, we need to act because of this demand. So social issues are very important, both from food security, which are very prominent now because of the food inflation, but also poverty, health, education, basic services. That's core IDB. IDB always has done this and needs to continue doing it, and even more now that you have quite a bit of more demand and more impatience for that. Number two, climate issues. Latin American, Caribbean have to be part of the solution of the public global goods and Paris targets, where we have mitigation. I think Latin America is very well positioned to help in this endeavor because you have the natural resources, you have the possibility of generating clean energy. But in addition, we need to work on adaptation. And for the countries in the region, they're already facing climate change. Climate change is not a possibility. It's there in the Caribbean. Every year or two, you have a hurricane and something happens there. Central America, same thing. You say, well, those are the most vulnerable. But you just had fires in Chile. A 100-year drought in Argentina, floods in Brazil. It is all across the region. So we need to take care about adaptation. What's happening now? How do we react immediately? Number 3, investments. What type of investment? Both the normal investment on physical infrastructure. We have to double. Today the region invests 2.8% of GDP. It needs to double that. It needs to go to much higher number than that. But also digital infrastructure. That's where we are now providing the services of government, but that's where innovation is coming. That's where growth can come, digitalization. And a lot of the projects of the IDB are about digitalizing services, of digitalizing the innovations. And to do that, you need to be connected. So we are now in the connectivity for all. And that's what we need in the region. I could go on, but I will let you continue, and I can continue if you want later.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Before, I'm sorry. Oh my. I don't know if we have to switch off. Okay. Thank you very much. Before I ask the next question to you, Juan, if you want to give any comment to what Ilan said about their priorities.
If you ask the question, I can respond to him and then go into the other one. Would that be easier for you? Yeah. Otherwise, I'll go on forever and you won't ask the question.
No, what I was going to ask you is because we want not only talk about Latin America, but the Latin America and its relationship with the US too. So I don't know if the United States is now, we are in the 2 years since President Biden arrived at the White House. In these 2 years, what would you say it was our biggest achievement in Latin America, and what is your unfinished business of the Biden administration?
Yes, and first of all, thank you for inviting me to this. It's really a pleasure to be here, Ambassador. Thank you for hosting us. Starting where, with the excellent laydown that Ilan gave of the region's challenges and the bank's priorities, if I would to summarize from our view some of the core challenges the region is facing and really reaffirming why it is that the Inter-American Development Bank is so important. They are, number one, a region that has one of the highest levels of inequality in the world in the face of a high concentration of political and economic power. The other is low human capital and productivity at a time when the world is essentially leaving Latin America behind in the adoption of technology, particularly some of the breakthroughs that we're on the cusp of achieving on AI and other areas. And the last is a continued dependence on commodities when the world is starting to undergo a transition, notwithstanding, of course, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that has done to oil markets. There's a clear trend here that most of the countries in Latin America are not prepared for. And so there is time to address a lot of these challenges, but not a lot of time, given some of the demographic changes that Latin America is undergoing. What does that mean for U.S. policy? Is that I think fundamentally the way that the president, even during his time as vice president, views that a region that is secure, middle class, and democratic is fundamentally in the national security interests of the United States. That may sound like a throwaway line in a speech, but it is really I think the guiding principle of how we've approached our policy toward the Americas. If you see the news right now in Latin America, here in the United States, it really has a focus on migration and how the U.S. is responding to migration. But we recognize that migration is a symptom of a broader challenge that Ilan mentioned and that I mentioned. And so to address the challenges of migration, you obviously need migration policy. We've, at the Summit of the Americas last year, launched a very ambitious initiative called the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration, recognizing that the migration challenge isn't just ours, but countries like Colombia, President Gustavo Petro is here this week and is going to meet with President Biden. They are in some ways facing the same, if not a greater, migration challenge. They're hosting a population of over 2.5 million Venezuelan migrants. And fundamentally, the reason that people move is because of security, because of lack of opportunity, and just, you know, the absence of jobs. So fundamentally, if you want to address symptoms like migration, you have to address the economic challenges. What I would say in terms of our successes is, I think the number one is that from the moment the president came in, and particularly in the first year, a renewed focus on rebuilding the strength of the U.S. economy. I think that would be number one. And the investments through the Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure, CHIPS and Science Act are really positioning the U.S. and the U.S. economy to compete globally. But that's also something that, for us, requires us to actually use it as a broader global economic platform. It means really a focus on North America, and that's been primarily our economic focus during the beginning of the administration. Our work with Canada and with Mexico, and then at the Summit of the Americas, the president launched the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity, and that is a question, I think, fundamentally of architecture, because we've had for the last 28, 29 years, give or take, U.S. economic policy has been focused on free trade as a solution to all the economic challenges of the region. And yes, integration matters. I think market-based economies matter, but it's insufficient when you look at, I think, a broader set of structural challenges that Latin America and the Caribbean is facing, and that it is fundamentally in our interest to help the region address them, because we want to address migration in a sustainable manner. You know, helping the region transition to climate-friendly technologies, finding ways to actually promote integration among Latin America and the Caribbean economies, not just greater trade and economic integration with us, has been the, I think, consistent challenge that the region has experienced, and one that we're committed to promoting. As a part of that, and I'll say two last things, I think that the evolution agenda that we have at the multilateral development banks is part of how you really get at some of these challenges in middle and high income regions like Latin America and the Caribbean, where the US on its own lacks the tools to actually address these challenges. We are foreign assistance, and a lot of our economic engagement, even treasuries, IDA funding, is meant for poor countries or countries in conflict. They don't help, they're not perfectly, I think, equipped to address bimodal nations like Colombia that are considered upper middle income, but have the highest level of inequality in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there's broad parts of that territory that could be considered low income in any other part of the world. How do you address these challenges that are more complex in a way that doesn't try to apply like a broad brush to how you approach some of these policy challenges? And in that regard, our work with Ilan and the Inter-American Development Bank is one where we are fully supportive of his reform agenda to try to tackle these challenges, because USAID is not going to fix it. It has to be something that has to be done in coordination with the private sector, with multilateral institutions, with the voice of members of the board of the IDB. And so I think we're delighted to be able to partner with him in that endeavor. And then lastly, if you look at over the kind of last 2 years, our engagement with Argentina and our support for them at the IMF, our support for democratic institutions in Colombia, our active engagement on democratic values in Brazil in the run-up to their election and after the events of January 8th, and even our efforts to really find a constructive relationship with countries like Mexico, where we have a lot of areas of disagreement. I think it is illustrative of this approach that the president has taken, which is that fundamentally we have to invest in our neighbors, not do what some of our predecessors did, which is think that a wall could really separate yourself from the problems of the region. You have to invest in your neighbors if you actually want to address your own national security interests. And that's fundamentally been an approach where you have to engage with countries, particularly at a time of great global dislocation, recognize that countries like Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia are not always going to be aligned with our perspective, but that we will find ways to work with them on issues that matter, and that matter to the people that voted for them, that fundamentally matter to us, and matter to the global system as it, I think in many ways, is finding a way to reorganize itself to address a lot of the challenges that we're facing today.
Thank you, Juan. Cynthia, I would like to know your take about what Juan said. And he spoke about the immigration and how the US doesn't have only to address their policies about immigration in Latin America, but you spoke a lot of times about the humanitarian crisis that immigration provokes. Now we've seen in the Darien zone between Panama and Colombia, thousands of people have tried to cross that border the last months. It's been a humanitarian crisis there. How do you think the US can help in a moment like this, in crisis like this? I know the government the US government has worked with Panama and Colombia about this particular problem. How you think the US is compromised in this kind of crisis when they happen?
Well, first of all, thank you again for this invitation, both to EFE. Is this on? Is that on now? Yes, there we go. To our distinguished ambassador from Spain, really appreciate this high-level audience as well as my co-panelists. Let me start out by addressing your question, reflecting on some of the things that Ilan and Juan have focused on. In thinking about today's event, I went back and I read the April reports of the World Bank and of the IMF that were prepared for the spring meetings that took place last week. And I came away with the most profound sense of pessimism vis-a-vis the region on almost every front. All of the kinds of effects of the pandemic that we know, a celebration of the recuperation of growth in 2021, but the projections for 2023 and 2024 are as bad or worse as the previous 7 decades leading up to 2019, when the region saw this explosion of social protests. The number of countries, Colombia, Ecuador, to a lesser extent Venezuela, Chile most notably, where the buildup of social tensions led to these so-called estallidos sociales, the social explosions, that the conditions in the region are now worse than they were in 2019, and the projection in the near future is even more grim. And you look at almost every variable, the decline in integration into the world economy, the decline in levels of foreign direct investment, on almost every variable, whether it's poverty or inequality, you know, in light of these tremendous and unprecedented shocks, food insecurity, greater oil prices, increases in poverty, at the same time that, as Ilan was saying, populations are more and more restive and more demanding of things from their governments. I see also a very pessimistic scenario for governance in the region. And I know that the Biden administration has put a great emphasis on making democracies deliver, on showing that democratic governments can deliver to their people. And if anything, where I would take Juan to task a little bit is in the gap between the resources available to improve the capacity of democratic governments to deliver, the gap between the resources and the discourse and the emphasis on these kinds of issues. And, you know, we have in the room, you know, representatives of the governments of the Dominican Republic and Panama. I mean, I think the Alliance for Development and Democracy formed by Costa Rica, Panama, the Dominican Republic, and now with Ecuador is a prime case in point where you have democracies, committed pro-US democratic governments that want to show to their people that their democratic governments can deliver the kinds of public goods that people want. And the US and the governments of the so-called ADD have signed a memorandum of understanding. But you also have to remember that Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Panama fall into this category of middle or high income countries. So they are not eligible for the kind of concessional lending that the development banks would provide. They're not eligible for priority loans from the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, which is a way of having the U.S. government stimulate private sector investment in areas that private companies might otherwise be reluctant to invest. And so I think there needs to be some radical rethinking of how we address the very dire situation that the region is in, that has seen a deterioration in almost every level or every kind of indicator of democratic governance, whether it's a respect for civil rights, an increasing authoritarianism in dealing with issues of crime and violence, press freedoms, fake news, the ability to counter fake news and bots. I mean, there's just every indicator, every organization that measures democracy, I think, has found this kind of backsliding. So we need to think about ways to reduce levels of public debt through debt relief, through vastly expanded debt for nature swaps to enhance the region's competitiveness on climate change adaptation and foster the green energy transition. I mean, there's just it cannot be business as usual. So that's a very long way of answering your question. People migrate because they cannot stay where they are. People don't migrate because they want to be closer to Disney. They do it because there is a physical threat to them and to their families. They do it because there is an utter lack of opportunity and an opportunity for not just for social mobility, but just for survival. And those kinds of push factors are precisely the things that the Biden administration has wanted to address. But I also have to put the onus a little bit back on Latin American countries. I mean, how many receptive allies are there in the Central American region that are committed to the norms of democratic governance in the way that the United States has traditionally defined that? Where is the commitment in the region to the kinds of important reforms that would attract private sector investment from the United States, from Europe, and elsewhere? Where is the commitment to greater equity in the tax system, to greater enforcement? I mean, there's just such a huge agenda, and it is urgent to address these questions. Last point, there was a staggering survey done by the Americas Barometer based at Vanderbilt University that showed that over half of people in Latin America would trade a stable income for the right to vote in an election. That is a staggering statistic, and it's one that ought to alarm all of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Cynthia. I would like to go back to Juan before Ilan, talking about this issue. You were talking about invest in your neighbors. Do you think it's very important? But at the same time, I would like you to talk about the immigration policies that has been in these 2 years, because everybody in Latin America, many people in Latin America expected a radical shift immigration policies with Biden administration. But the thing is, there are rules that are still in effect, like Title 42, and there's not been that immigration reform that everybody wants to apply. So up at this point, is enough what the administration has done in immigration policies, or the issue is to try to invest, as you say? What is the way to do? What are the steps that have to be taken? Because you say you have to invest in your neighbors. What are the steps that the U.S. are taking to invest in their neighbors?
Yes, and I'll start where Cindy kind of by agreeing with everything you said in terms of the need to actually have these tools. And we have, the DFC has taken reform to be able to actually assume an equity stake in its investments. They've expanded that to $1 billion over the last fiscal year. We're increasing the amount of debt for climate swaps and trying to find ways to make some of these reforms. But fundamentally it is a question of the global institutions that we developed after the Second World War. It's about the conversations that Ilan is leading. It's the ones that we're pushing at the World Bank, because what you don't want to do is create a competition between the Sustainable Development Goals, which remain a very top priority, and addressing some of these challenges of middle income states. And these are obviously not an assistance question of a developed country to a developing country. It is really about how we can make these institutions respond to, I think, the challenges of today, not the challenges that they were initially designed for. Those conversations, unfortunately, take time. But fundamentally, we do not see this as an assistance challenge, but a broader kind of reform and architecture challenge that this administration has been championing at the World Bank and prioritized at the IDB and other places. In terms of migration, first recognize that the president very early on put forward immigration reform efforts that did not get traction in Congress. And in the absence of that, despite active efforts, Senator Menendez played a very active role in the Senate in advancing these. In the absence of that, there are limits to policy. And right now, our migration policy is one where the refugee system is one that does not benefit Latin America and the Caribbean because of the way that it was designed. And we have limited tools at our disposal. But I think any immigration policy has to include a couple of things, and it is something that we are working on. The first is there has to be a consequence regime, meaning that you have to be able to enforce U.S. laws. You have to be able to, you have to have a functioning border that will consider asylum petitions, refugee claims, and is able to manage the flow of people. Those who do not benefit from asylum are repatriated. But then you also have to have legal pathways, and that's something that the program that we launched with a community of Cubans, Nicaraguans, Haitians, and Venezuelans is one that is intended to basically take the income stream away from smugglers and creating opportunities for people in a way that they don't have to cross the Darien, but rather they can actually find a way to petition for parole from the region, for example. And we're looking to expand those. There's a lot of litigation underway, and it's a very difficult path for us to navigate. But fundamentally, again, the president sees this as a comprehensive challenge that needs to be not just a function of U.S. immigration policy, of kind of our immigration policy abroad, but then also of fundamentally investing in our neighbors. And I think that the visit of President Gustavo Petro this week is really going to put those at the center, because I think in some ways the challenges that Colombia is dealing with are illustrative of challenges the rest of the region is experiencing, but I think at an exponential level, given the number of migrants that they're seeing, double-digit inflation, very low growth prospects. As a Colombian American, I know very well that there was a migration flow in the late 90s to Venezuela. Those Venezuelans have moved to Colombia. Traditionally, these are populations that stay in South America because they can find opportunity. But if you're in the kind of Caribbean band of Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, and you're not able to find a job, the only option you have is to go north. And so we need to find a way. We last year approved $800 million loan that was an IDB World Bank loan at concessional rates. We need to do a lot more of that so that countries like Colombia and others don't have to make a choice between how they assign fiscal resources to address the migration challenge or invest in like education. We need to create those tools and mechanisms, and that's an ongoing conversation.
Ilan, how the IDB is helping with this policy that defend the United States, that attack the roots of the immigration in their countries, to try to help them to have better economic opportunities to let people stay in their countries. How the IDB is helping in this goal right now?
I'm gonna answer this question, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about the more general strategy of where an Inter-American Development Bank can help in this broader goal for the region. On your question, people move, when you ask them, they move for economic reasons. Of a majority, you do service, 90% ask, I need to move, I don't have economic conditions. So what the IDB does and needs to do is give them livelihood and improve their lives so that they root into their communities. What does it mean? It means that you work on their basic conditions, water and sanitation. That's infrastructure, one of the priorities we mentioned, but also social. You have projects where you give them skills so that they have jobs. If they have jobs, they feel that they can root to the community, they contribute, they have income. You give them electricity. That's one of the projects we have. And electricity connecting not only one country, but connecting from one country to the other. It's one of the regional projects that we are proud of developing. You help small and medium enterprises through our IDB Invest, which is the private sector arm, and you give resources so that the small and medium enterprises, usually when you're close to this type of credit to small and medium, you realize that a lot of small and medium are individuals, few individuals together. So when you give them credit, they represent the large amount of business, if you want numbers, and you provide them their jobs too. It's not only businesses, there are jobs there when you do that. So when you start functioning and looking at implementing what you do is where you're actually gonna make the changes and the results. For the Central America, just to give you an example where there is a lot of attention now, the IDB has financed $1 billion just now with $100 million for technical assistance. The technical assistance are resources that you can use for building institutions, helping plan. So for example, security. Security is another issue that it's livelihood of people. People feel secure. They feel that they can stay in the community. So we at the IDB, you help design the security plans and programs. We have a platform between the countries where there's several initiatives, and it's always very difficult to get into the violence and security. But you use one experience to help the other. So it's also technical assistance. And when you sum these efforts of security, infrastructure, which is electricity, water, social sanitation, with efforts to promote jobs through skills, but also through small and medium enterprises, you start generating the changes that you need to root the people into the community. And that's the way I understand is where an international organization, a development bank, can really help, is concentrating on the root causes, not on the symptoms, as Juan was mentioning, but concentrate directly in the root. And more than that, we have to be directly responsible for the indicators, what we change. We just have to stop thinking about how many resources we need or how much capital we have. We need to concentrate in, are we giving them really more jobs? How many people are connected now in terms of connectivity? How many people were able to root out of poverty? Have we reduced the violence numbers? This is what we need to concentrate, and this is what actually we're going to change. And last but not least, answer a more general issue is, I think Juan and Cynthia are right. And I think the role of the multilateral organizations is to look at the countries and to devise a strategy where you can actually prioritize. You cannot just say, well, we're going to do everything, because we want to do everything. And we are demanded to do everything, because each member country wants something, each government wants something else different, each stakeholder wants. But the hard job we have is to say, well, this is our priorities. We need to tackle social because of the demands that Cynthia mentioned and Juan mentioned. We need to root people, so we need to give them jobs or growth and investment. And we cannot forget that climate change has arrived, is in the region, and so those are the priorities we give, and you can talk about a lot of them, but we as an international organization need to think about the result, need to think about implementation, and need to think about scaling. What does it need to scale? Is to really make a difference. And to make a difference, you need to concentrate. You need to focus. You need to bundle together private sector, public sector. You need to do it with other international organizations, and we need to do it with other donors. If you're able to somehow coordinate, you may make a difference. If we are scattered and each one does something different, we are not going to get there.
Thank you, Ilan. You were talking, Juan, about the visit of the President of Colombia, Gustavo Petro. He's going to meet President Biden next Thursday. And we were talking about help these countries to achieve, to get better economies, so they don't need, the people from the countries, they don't need to use immigration. So in this case, Gustavo Petro told yesterday in the UN, he asked to lift the sanctions to Venezuela. Venezuela is one of the countries that is suffering massive exodus. So what the White House thinks about this petition that I'm sure Petro is going to ask to Biden next Thursday.
Yes, I can imagine. I imagine that'll be a topic of conversation between the presidents. So look, our policy on Venezuela is clear, is that we are ready and have demonstrated our willingness to alleviate the pressure of sanctions in support of a negotiated outcome that leads to free and fair elections. Now, the things that we're asking for are not things that the United States cooked up or the opposition cooked up. The European Union sent an observation mission to Venezuela, made a series of recommendations, all very clear, common sense, to level the playing field electorally. Any of those steps would be ones that we would, I think, reciprocate in kind with the alleviation of pressure. But the idea that the unilateral lifting of sanctions pressure is going to improve the condition of Venezuelans is inaccurate, because what we have right now is an attempt at authoritarian central planning in a country where there'll be a few people that'll benefit from that. But the reality is that the broad humanitarian condition in the country predated US sanctions. It was a result of economic mismanagement, the reduction of civil and democratic liberties that existed beforehand. It was, before Chavez, Venezuela was an imperfect democracy, but a democracy nonetheless. And now the closure of the democratic space is nothing that US sanctions have been the result of. And so what we are asking for is simple. And what we are trying to do, and I think we view positively Colombia's organization of an international conference to have this conversation as an international community. They're pretty clear steps. It's not a regime change strategy. It's a Venezuelans choose their leader strategy. And I think we would want to get to a situation where these elections are held in an environment where there are no sanctions on Venezuela. But it is something where steps really need to be taken, and we will move, I think, in kind with those steps, which are all, if you look at them, things like an electoral calendar, a registry, inviting an international observer. These are things that you ask anybody would see as like the basic tenets of a potentially free and fair election. And I think that's a discussion that we are eager to have with the countries of the region, and especially in Colombia, where in the run-up to their election, there were calls for us to speak out against Petro, to how could you, for some parts, even in our political system, how could you help him get elected? And fundamentally, our approach to the region is that the Colombian people decide who their leaders are, and the Venezuelan people should decide, the Brazilian people should decide. And these are, I think, beyond these broader economic questions, the basic premise of the system is that the sovereignty of a country rests in the people's decision to actually vote for their representatives. And that's the basic proposition that we are looking for in Venezuela. And so we've taken 2 years to dismantle what in our view has been a failed policy by the Trump administration to impose pressure through draconian sanctions in the absence of really an international conversation about what the expectation was for the country. What's happening right now in Venezuela, you could call a 21st century civil conflict that's going on. And as somebody as a Colombian American who, saw the National Front as the answer to a political system that really implied the destruction of whoever was voted out of office. My grandfather actually was a mayor in Miraflores, Boyacá, had to flee in the middle of the night because they were coming to kill him. That was a system that existed before the National Front. I'm not suggesting that that's what Venezuela needs, because it's not for us to decide, but there need to be democratic guarantees. And there needs to be a system to underpin how the Venezuelan I think people really determine the future, and we're ready to accompany that and have demonstrated that we'll take tough political decisions for ourselves. The decision to grant Chevron a license, the decision to engage. My trip to Caracas last year was probably not the smartest political move for myself, but it was the right thing to do to actually support dialogue, and we're ready to do it.
Cynthia, I would like to take, before ask you another question and change the subject, I would like to take on what Juan said about this approach with countries like Venezuela, not impose, but talk with them and try to see advances in democracy.
I think the approach that Juan has laid out makes a lot of sense, which is that the strategy of applying sanctions, squeezing them until they cry uncle, has obviously failed. I don't think there's any place in the world where it's worked. At the same time, because of levels of corruption, levels of criminality within the Venezuelan government, it's unlikely that increasing resource flows that go through the government will benefit needy Venezuelans. And so I think this kind of calibrated approach, kind of you do this, we do that, is the way to go. If anything, and I don't know what takes place behind closed doors, but if anything, what might be helpful is to lay out for the Venezuelan government, if you do this, then we will do that. Whether it's on a piece of paper or in a discussion, a sense of what is needed to revert the sanctions that are as severe as anything as the United States has ever applied. The one place where I might take the US government a little bit to task is that there are supposedly exemptions on the sanctions for humanitarian activities. And it is a great principle, but in practice is not working the way that it should. And because of the severity of the sanctions, especially the financial sanctions, the risk averseness of people that would be providing loans or help to civil society organizations to be able to import goods is huge. And they have to revert to all kinds of, complex mechanisms to get the funding that they need and the dollars that they need to be able to import humanitarian supplies. So that might be an area that would be fruitful to look into. At the same time, there is this humanitarian agreement that was agreed to between the Venezuelan opposition and the government, which was going to provide use the funds, the frozen assets of the Venezuelan government in the United States and in Europe to help finance a humanitarian assistance program. There has not been progress on that, and the assets remain frozen, and there are a lot of complex issues about what would happen if the assets were frozen. Would the so-called, vulture funds in New York just make a huge dive into them, and once they were made available for some purposes, would they become available for every purpose? But that is the sticking point, is the fate, the destino of these assets that have been frozen abroad. So I think that there's a lot of movement because it's in Colombia's interest to improve the economic situation in Venezuela, so there are less pressures to migrate, not just Colombia, but I would say all of South America and the Caribbean that have been the recipients of these huge Venezuelan refugee flows, historic levels of migration.
Thank you. Before I let the floor to make some questions, I would like to ask you, the three of you, about I would like to begin with you, Cynthia, about the increasing presence of China in the region. As you see, I don't know, not only in investments and in trade, and it's been a bigger presence that is it's been in the relations and in the alliance between these countries from this region with China. And I don't know how you see the U.S., if you think the U.S. has put a lot of effort in the relationship with the region, or China is doing better at this moment. What do you think about that?
Well, I think China has state institutions, state banks, and so-called private banks that are in effect, dependent on the state, that make it much more, that make its lending much more flexible and easy to implement. We all know the story. I mean, the huge demand for commodities, has converted China into the principal trading partner. It's also a huge support of infrastructure and other kinds of loans and investments. It had dropped off entirely, I think, as China was retrenching and looking at the viability of and the ability of countries to repay the Chinese loans, and there's been all sorts of attempts to renegotiate levels of debt. There was no lending in 2021 by Chinese banks. It's come back in 2022. About it's still less than $1 billion, but still it's something. Two central points. One is that Latin American countries do not want to be forced into this kind of binary choice between China and the United States. Countries want productive relationships with both partners. Two, in Latin America, for the most part, and with exceptions of places like Nicaragua or Venezuela, or even not so much Cuba, but those two countries, China is seen as a development opportunity, whereas in the United States it's seen as a strategic threat, whether in 5G or in predatory lending, and those two visions don't meet. China will continue to be an important economic force in the region, and the United States the U.S. government simply does not have the resources to compete, neither do most of the development banks, quite frankly.
Juan, what's your take on this, considering, for example, that Brazilian president just went to visit China and underscored the alliance between these two countries? What's your take on this? Do you think the United States has a disadvantage, as he said, that China has more power right now to improve the relationship?
Yeah, so what I'll say is that, we are confident in our relationship with Brazil. The president has had numerous conversations with Lula. They had an excellent visit while they were here, and certainly respect that Brazil is going to have relationships with whatever country it chooses, a sovereign nation. And China has relationships with 200 countries. We have, commercial relations, notwithstanding a lot of disagreements. We're also, I think I would say, we're ready to compete globally with China. And the president has really invested in U.S. economy and frankly played a global leadership role on everything from climate change to the pandemic, to show that really leadership is about addressing shared challenges. And so, and fundamentally, if China is investing in the security and prosperity of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, it is advancing our core interests in the region. Now, what I would say is that, I think that I've talked a lot about democracy, and for us in the hemisphere, the concept of democracy is a strategic reserve, in that fundamentally it is what allows people to have a say in their institutions. It lends to stability if democracies can actually deliver. So for us, it's strategic importance. But those sorts of, I think, narratives wear thin over time in a kind of global South that is being impacted not just by the pandemic, but this conflict. And countries like Brazil are far enough away that if you were to ask a Brazilian on the street what their views were on Ukraine, I think they would say that they were thinking more about putting food on the table and their chances of education, economic opportunity, than what some of them view as a conflict for Central Europe that has taken place for the last 300 years. I think that in that context, there are a couple things that we are taking to China, but also to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that is, the first is that we have a UN charter, and we have certain responsibilities that we have all signed up for, and that we welcome countries like Brazil playing an important leadership role in peace. The idea that the US does not support peace or had something to do with the starting of the war is just not born on fact. You all saw that we spent all of 2021 trying to prevent the war from happening and have been supporting supporting peace. The other is, I would say that, particularly as it relates to these questions of global strategic competition, you can look back to World War II and how I think Getulio Vargas would have been very happy to sit out World War II had the U.S. not actually engaged in helping make it worth their while. And what I mean by that is the investments in the development of Brazilian agriculture, which have made it a powerhouse global food producer today. The development of the steel industry in Brazil are ones where the United States was actively involved in. And so we cannot get so caught up in this moment right now that we lose sight of the fact that I think most of the global South sees that the developed nations are on the cusp of major technological breakthroughs, and that they're ultimately going to pick the side that is helping them or will benefit them in that regard. And so for us, we need to see Brazil's prosperity as a nation, embrace, I think, its role and its voice in global fora, in a way that they view the system not as one where we're forcing them to choose, but that they see their interests are really aligned with a certain set of core values that the U.S. represents. I think if you ask Brazilians on the street or Argentines on the street, I think they would be able to tell you more about the U.S. and their affinities for the U.S. than they would of China. And I think that's, a competitive advantage that we have if we can deliver.
Ilan, in this context, in this competition between the US and China, do you think it would be a good moment for Latin America to try the economic integration like we have, for example, in Europe? And do you think it's possible, considering the differences between these countries?
I will say that regional integration is not only possible, but very desirable. We have intra-regional trade at just 16%, much lower than the rest of the world, Asia, not only Europe that you mentioned, but other regions. It is imperative that the region integrates more in several areas. I just mentioned trade, but I can give you several examples where delivering, as one mentioned, to the people makes a lot of difference. Number one, having infrastructure, transmission of electricity from one country to the other sometimes makes a lot of sense and can bring light to the people's house in regions where it's far away from the center and maybe closer to the neighbor. And we need to make sure that transmission mechanism so that all Latin America and the Caribbean is connected. Not only electricity, but infrastructure. How do you go roads, transports? That is trade, but it's also movement between people. We mentioned physical, but also digital. We need to be able to connect between one country and the other. Let me give you an example. The Caribbean, they are separated by the sea. But if they can be connected digitally, that is essential for them to act together. And acting together today makes a lot of difference. Climate, they all face the same climate problem. If they can together bunch and they try to diversify the risks, or they have an effort together with the IDB coordinated, that's what we're trying to push, clearly they're going to get a better outcome for their citizens. Another example, water. Fresh water is as important as climate in general. It's one of the development goals. In the region, there's enough water. It's just not distributed in the way you need. And some of this water is public in the sense that you cannot divide exactly which sovereign is the owner of that. We need to integrate that. We need to have somehow to distribute this fresh water equitable between the region. Last but not least, I'll give you another regional project which we believe there is a momentum now to push further, Amazon. We do, and there are other issues that are conflicts, but in terms of the Amazon and the nature and the biodiversity, I do believe we have now an opportunity where some confluence of political changes with priorities, including of the IDB, gives now the momentum to advance in terms of biodiversity, deforestation, in a way that you can do it not only political, but maybe an IDB can coordinate the economic part. What does it mean, coordinate the economic part of Amazon? You need to give people the livelihood. It's not only not the forest, to give an alternative to whoever was getting his livelihood from the deforestation. You give him the job from what he can do after we stop deforesting. You need to talk to the municipalities, the small municipalities, how can they address it? You need to give them capacity and the execution capacity. You need to talk to small businesses. There are businesses in the Amazon. You need to give them the capacity to flourish so that they have their sustainability there. If you think about it, that's a lot of things to do and a lot of coordination to do. That's not a country effort. That's a regional effort. And an international organization or a regional bank like the IDB is where we have the comparative advantage of look at a group of countries instead of looking at only your own citizen, which is natural because you are elected when you are a government. But our mandate is for the region. So when you ask me if it's possible to have regional integration, I tell you not only it's possible, but it's desirable, and it's a way to go forward for the region because it really needs to integrate more in today's world.
Thank you very much to the three of you. Now we are going to open the floor for questions. I don't know, I know there's people from the embassies, people from the media. So if you want to take some questions, please raise your hand. There's one hand here.
Thank you, Patricia. I have a question for Juan and one for Juan and for Ilan. Juan, about the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, he's been under investigation for potential ethical issue. The investigation is over. EFE reported yesterday that the report cleared Almagro of any wrongdoing, signals some lack of common sense. The US said that the investigation was fair. Is the White House confident that Almagro can keep leading the OAS? And a question for both of you about Argentina. Minister Massa was here last week for the spring meetings. He's asking for more support at the IMF and also at the IEP. What do you think Argentina needs to do to get continuing support from the White House and the IDB? Thanks.
Thank you for not making me answer the Argentina IMF question. It's best for an economist to, and an expert on these issues. So like I'll want to address, there was, I think I don't know what the medium was, but there was this report that I wanted to have Almagro removed, and I would say that's ridiculous, because I've known Luis Almagro for a really long time, and you know, he was elected to the role, and we've worked constructively with him. We have a zero tolerance policy on ethics violations in this administration, and that has led to some decisions that we've taken in a number of different fora. The State Department, you know, reviewed the report and concluded that there was no ethics violation, so we're going to continue to work with Almagro as the Secretary General of the Organization of American States. And we can't afford not to work with the Organization of American States, particularly when right now some of the main challenges that we're facing in the region are Pan-American conversations that require all of us to have very candid conversations and require really, I think, leadership that we currently have at the Inter-American Development Bank, that we have at the Organization of American States, to organize ourselves and address a lot of these issues, to governance, to economic challenges, and not really boil it down to personalities. So, I mean, the State Department is right, and we're going to continue to work with the OAS because it matters.
What we can do, and the question is for Argentina, but it's more ample. What we can do for the people. Number one, we should look at their social conditions. So we need to be able to provide them projects where give them indicators where their livelihood improves. That looks abstract now, but I'm going to get more precise. There was just a loan based on health indicators that is approved. That's not for a specific government, that's actually for the people, where your indicator is the amount of people that get prevention, the amount of people that get vaccines, sometimes changes in legislation, the amount of reduction on mortality rates, access to hospitals, so those are the projects that an IDB can help, and they are not 6 months or 1 year. There are projects that go over the years and go to help the people. And that I just described, it's an actual project in Argentina. Another project, we want to be there for the big natural events that happen, and to be able to help the people once a natural event happens. The beginning, we were all thinking about hurricanes and what we're seeing in Central America and the Caribbean, and it's still there. We're still discussing whether our help should be based on vulnerability. Should we change profoundly the way we're going to help these countries? And this discussion is still in the way, and I'm actually would like to push for that, because I think we need to rethink that. But it's broader than that. There's a credit line for drought in Argentina, where we approved relatively fast resources for the small farmers to be able to sustain them during this catastrophe. So it's Argentina, but it's also maybe Chile with the fires. It's also flooding in other places. And it's Barbados, it's Bahamas, all of them. So we need to think about it. So that's the way we help countries. And Argentina is not different in this regard. We need to be there for the people of Argentina in the areas where I think we have the capacity and the comparative advantage to do: health, education, social, infrastructure, climate. Those are our priorities, and we need to continue doing them, especially in these times.
Now? Oh, okay, there we go. I'm Salome Ramirez for Voice of America Spanish Service. And my question is related specifically to Juan, and maybe if I can have some of Dr. Arson's opinion on this too, is first you talked about invested in neighbors and how this also applies to migration and to tackling those things that make migration such a challenge. But talking also about Title 42 and the expected finalizing of that policy on May 11th, there was a proposed rule from Homeland Security saying that those people that don't apply for asylum on transit countries won't be eligible for asylum in the US. So maybe my question is two. One, how does that represent the interest of migrants if most of them, of course, we know they're transited in an illegal way and they don't have maybe a way of applying for refugee in countries like Mexico, Costa Rica, countries that they have to go through to be able to get to the US. And the second part of the question, which is about investing in neighbors, is then how can the US then maybe strengthen the refugee programs in these transit countries for these people, not also to be able to provide that refugee to migrants, but for them to actually be an option for migrants, because they are not traveling north searching to stay in one of those countries. They are trying to get to the US. So maybe that's my two-part question, the impact that it has for migrants, this proposed rule, and how would the US strengthen those countries to be able to provide a good refugee program for these migrants?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you're asking the million-dollar question, but I want to say something just on Argentina, because I don't want to dismiss kind of the U.S. role here, is that I'll say first, in addition to everything Ilan said, which is, I think, right on about how you address some of these challenges that countries like Argentina and others are facing. Look, I do have to give credit to the Fernandez government and to Sergio Massa. They're navigating a very challenging, not just political environment, but economic environment in an election year. And Sergio in particular, they're moving forward with concrete steps, but the challenge is enormous. So the conversations we've had with him have been that the bottom line is that it has to be really the Treasury Department, the IMF, the World Bank, the IDB, that arrive at really agreements on how to tackle these challenges, and the US will always play a constructive role in that conversation, including the White House. We, Jake Sullivan, the Deputy National Security Advisor for Economic Policy at the time, Dalip Singh, now Mike Pyle, have been in active conversations to try to find a way that is most supportive. And a lot of it for us stems from, I think, the response to the 2002 economic crisis, where we want to help our countries like Argentina navigate very, very complex, I think, political economy, but also just a global situation. But on the migration question, I'll say is that there is this long standing, I think, policy in Latin America that migration is a right. And I think while I don't disagree with that, it is also often used as an excuse to not have robust asylum and integration systems in some countries. I would invite you to look at the rate at which asylum applications are approved throughout Latin America. And you'll see great disparity, despite the Cartagena Declaration in 1984, making very clear the shared responsibility that we have in the task. So the LA Declaration is part of our response to that, which is to recognize that migration is not a US border problem, it's a regional challenge where the US has to step up, but also the countries of the region need to work together to address the challenge in a way that, yes, there are enforcement regimes, but create also legal pathways and figure out the best way to make investments to give people the right to remain in their countries of origin. You're not going to solve the migration problem at the Darien Gap. You have to solve it in the source countries where people are leaving. In terms of the refugee system, I'll say, as someone who's been in these conversations, but is not a migration expert, but I've been in these conversations during the Obama administration, when we were out of government, and now the kind of rules that govern our refugee system are part of an international convention that don't favor refugee status for countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, right? This is, if you're coming from a war-torn state or a state in conflict, yes, that's why you see that we're able to grant refugee status to large numbers of Afghans, but Haiti is a country that still has a very low rate of kind of refugee status because of the rules that govern that tool or that mechanism that we can use. The other is obviously parole. And that's something, and we have temporary protected status, so these are tools, but they're insufficient tools to address, I think, some of the challenges that require robust legal pathways in the Western Hemisphere in particular. But they're a subject of debate with Congress, of litigation. Whenever we take steps, we get sued, they get moved back. And so this is an ongoing process in the absence of actually legislative action on immigration reform in the United States. But fundamentally, again, it goes back, I think, to the economic question for us and the need to have countries like Colombia, Mexico, and others see migration as a developmental challenge, not just as a humanitarian crisis that is of like processing migrants, but actually integrating them into society in a way that doesn't force trade-offs for countries.
Sure. With the disclaimer, with the disclaimer that I also am not a migration expert. I mean, I think that, once again, there's this enormous gap between the political salience, the kind of radioactive valence of the immigration debate in the United States and the tools that the U.S. government has, again, not challenging the sense that it's a regional problem and that countries all need to take a look at this. But there's a gap between the resources that would be available to make a more humane asylum and migration process available to people that are going to continue to come. And I think that's what we also have to face, is that economic conditions in the region are not going to change from one year to the next. It's going to be a long-standing problem, I think. And climate as a driver of migration is also going to become more acute, whether you look at the dry corridor in Central America or the severity of hurricanes that hit the Caribbean and Central America. I mean, the push factors behind migration are not going to go away and arguably are going to get worse. And so the question is really, what can you put in place and what can you staff at appropriate levels to make it possible for people with a legitimate asylum claim to be processed quickly, and also with the support of the Congress, and who knows whether that will ever exist, to create some kind of pathways to legalization. People talk about, I got in line, and waited, and everybody else needs to get in line. It's not only that the line doesn't move, it's like there is no line. I mean, people's things just disappear. Someone applies for asylum and it can be years before they even have an acknowledgement of receipt of that application because the staffing issues are as acute as they are. So I think a lot has to happen, not just this administration, but thinking medium and long term about how to make this more rational. Not easy in this climate.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. I think we're out of time. I'm really sorry. I don't know if you want to say some close remarks But first of all, I want to thank the three of you for having with us in this, our first EFE Dialogues. And thank you everybody for having accompanied us. And of course, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you, Miguel Albero, for hosting us in this magnificent place. And now we're gonna have a little taste of Spanish food after this. So if you wanna stay, we will be happy. Thank you.
Thank you.